Are we ready, Jake?
Yeah.
All right. Welcome to CHI's Existential Detective Fiction. This is week 5, The Impossibility of Perfect Justice, looking at Raymond Chandler's essay, The Simple Art of Murder, and the first of the short stories in this collection called Spanish Blood. Before we get started, we'll do a little bit of review from last week. Last week we discussed the need for faith, which is a stance that accepts uncertainty as a rival to knowledge as a way to encounter the world. Only through faith, Fichte argued, can we most fully realize our own most potential and resolve the conflict between head and heart that erupts with the search for knowledge. Fichte then described how beginning with faith can lead the reader to a more just world and a fulfillment of our vocation through the will. The will, intertwined with the small voice that prompted Fichte's thinking I throughout, ends up being the most important resource that we as humans have. It bridges that which is internal with that which is external, and it allows us to become responsible and capable actors in the world. So that was the summary from Fichte, and we're done with Fichte for now. Preview. This week we shift into something different, Chandler's Simple Art of Murder. Chandler offers an analysis of what makes detective fiction work. And throughout the essay, we'll examine the question then, what do detective plots say about our existential plight as human beings? So that'll be kind of the guiding framework for the rest of tonight. So here we go. Chandler begins his essay with the assertion that fiction, in general, quote, has always intended to be realistic, unquote. Detective fiction, by contrast, quote, is usually about murder and hence lacks the element of uplift. Right? I mean, there's not too much that's cheery about a murder body. Corresponding to our discussion of justice throughout this class, Chandler recognizes that such stories have, quote, a good deal of sociological implication, but it has been going on too long for it to be news, unquote. Mystery novels seldom are realistic. Instead, it is, quote, written in a certain spirit of detachment. Otherwise, nobody but a psychopath would want to write it or read it, right? And that's what makes us able to enjoy this, just that little bit of distance that the novel gives. This level of attachment, just as a reminder, accords with one of the first two attempts that Fichte made at having a coherent worldview. In other words, the murder can be objectively written as something deterministically caused by external factors, something somewhat like Oedipus was, or it can be written by a consciousness that remains divorced from everything observed along the lines of Fichte's conversation with spirit. And that's more along the lines of an omniscient narrator, right? Although both are untenable ways of living, supposing one agrees with Fichte, which I think we all did by the end of each of those classes, they're not bad ways of writing. So from narrative standpoint, you can have both of those as alternative modes of narration, which aren't great for living, but they're great to read. Does that make sense? And that gives us the detachment that's reprehensible in our own lives. That's the psychopath, but it's great fiction writing. We okay with that? Okay. All right, so Chandler then continues and adds that, quote, the murder novel also has a depressing way of minding its own business, solving its own problems and answering its own questions. There's nothing left to discuss. And that's the good murder novel. Put otherwise, or the other way to think about it, is that the murder novel is a closed system. It allows us the satisfaction of having the questions answered, a satisfaction that distracts us in many ways from the questions about ourselves that we'd rather not face. We can gain a certain kind of satisfaction from inhabiting this type of environment, the satisfaction that we get from watching a good action movie where there are the bad guys and the good ones and the good guys win, right? There's something satisfying, like, the Avengers won again. Of course they did, right? I mean, there's no doubt really in anybody's mind throughout the movie who's going to win. The pleasure comes in watching that become fulfilled. So we might, in those kinds of movies, you may forget about the movie's plot almost instantly, but we don't feel cheated by it as a consequence. So these kinds of stories, most genre fiction actually, they're stories that have that closed element within them. And so we enter into them, we accept whatever rules that the genre places before us, and then we leave really unchanged. I mean, there's nothing profoundly moving about a good action movie, right? You're not going to transform your life in response to that. You just get distracted. And the distractions are really nice. They're useful, right? Because you're not thinking about anything else in your life that's going on. You end your engagement with the detective novel or the action movie or whatever it is, and then you pick up with your own life here and move on. Does that make sense? Okay. Page 4. What distinguishes detective fictions from other kinds of writing at least for Chandler, is the fact that, quote, this middling, dull, pooped out piece of utterly unreal and mechanical fiction is not very different from what are called the masterpieces of the art. It drags on a little more slowly, the cheating is a little more obvious, but it is the same kind of book. Whereas the good novel is not at all the same kind of book as the bad novel. It is about entirely different things. The good detective story and the bad detective story are about exactly the same things, and they are about them in very much the same way. Put otherwise, whereas the scope of a good novel is universal and it exposes the depths of the human plight of being in the world, the scope of a detective story is limited to murder or crime and its investigation, right? And so what it's about, in other words, what kinds of questions it asks and answers, is always going to be limited by the nature of genre, right? You recognize detective fiction by what it is, right? But the way that you're able to instantly recognize that it's detective fiction are the same things that really limit it, and it makes it so that the bad and the good pretty much do the same thing. They're not that different, which is why a lot of pulp thrillers get made, because they're just pretty close to the same thing, just a dime a dozen, literally, almost. 10 cents. Yeah. Or just a dime, a dozen. All right. Chandler then describes the problem inherent in the genre as a paradox, given the contrasting demands of traditional or classical logic and the deduction novel of detection. Right, and so on the one hand, we have logic, and you contrast that with deduction. This is the classical, and this is investigative. So he says that it demands a combination of qualities that are not found in the same mind. That's the problem. The people who can do this are not the people who can do that. He gives a set of different approaches to the genre then. So there are 4 different ways that authors for him have tried to navigate through this divide. Number 1, there's the cool-headed constructionist. This offers flat characters, poor pacing, and inadequate detail. But great control, like all the plot elements make sense, right? You have hoop 1, hoop 2, hoop 3, hoop 4, voila. But nothing else is real. But you're fascinated by the mechanism, right? Number 2, the grim logician, who offers about as much atmosphere as a drawing board. Number 3, the scientific sleuth offers great equipment, but you can't remember the face, right? I mean, it's all about, it's I don't know. I've never watched CSI, but I imagine that's kind of what CSI is, but I don't really know because I've never watched the show. But it's just like, here's the gizmos that allow you to solve it technically, but you don't remember the people, you just remember the gadgets. And number 4 are the vivid and colorful prose writers who won't break down unreliable alibis, right? So when you get somebody who really knows how to write language well, they'll come up with these preposterous alibis that just hold water somehow, and you're left there riveted by the prose, but unable to actually think about it, because once you think about it, then everything falls apart. So those are the 4 ways kind of around this problem, and Chandler isn't happy about any of them. What he says is that the qualities of a detective story often require blending specialized knowledge of antiquities or needlework or art or whatever the murder happens to involve, as well as police protocols, love, poison, and just other random things. A good writer needs to know the world, the rational life of the mind, and the passionate life that leads to the commission of crime, and in addition to that, needs to know how to write it in an engaging fashion, right? In other words, to put it in short, a good writer has to be a good writer and an existentialist. If you don't understand human existence, you're not going to be able to write a good detective story. Make sense? Okay, page 5. Chandler then discusses the mistakes that are made with this story, beginning with Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes. The latter, for him, is, quote, mostly an attitude and a few dozen lines of unforgettable dialogue. He also mentions Howard Haycraft and claims that, quote, 2/3 or 3/4 of all the detective stories published still adhere to the formula of the giants that the giants of this era created, perfected, polished, and sold to the world as problems of logic and deduction. He discusses a story by A.A. Milne, best known for his creation of Winnie the Pooh, to claim that, quote, the story is a problem of logic and detection. And then he continues on page 6 saying, quote, if it is not that, it is nothing at all. There is nothing else for it to be. If the situation is false, you cannot even accept it as a light novel, for there's no story for the light novel to be about. If the problem does not contain the elements of truth and plausibility, it is no problem. If the logic is an illusion, there's nothing to deduce. Okay? So if it's going to set itself up to be a detective story, and it's going to pose you with a problem, it has to work through that problem in a convincing and coherent way. If it can't do that, if the mystery is too big of a cheat, there's no novel even to read, right? Because the whole of the story is wrapped up in an initial mystery that's then turned out and eventually resolved or explained. So that's Chandler's point. I think that the story offers a little bit more than what Chandler suspects. It's the possibility of an inquiry, however poor, into the human condition. Okay? But at the same time, what he says holds as a necessity of the detective work. You won't be satisfied with the story if the problem emerges because characters are too stupid to see what's obvious. Right? There's nothing more frustrating than a stupid character who just can't get what's a really obvious thing to get. That's not a good story either.
Except the Pink Panther.
Well, yeah. Inspector Clouseau is delightful to watch mumble about. I mean, yeah, okay, so there are exceptions, but overall,
that's humor.
Right, that's not a detective thing the same way. So part of the thrill of the story is anticipating where the end will occur, and it's most satisfying if you figure it out more or less at the same time as the detective, right? Those are the best kinds of stories where you have your kind of aha moments pretty much right around the same time as the detective. Is that fair? Okay. Chandler then offers a point-by-point breakdown of the Milne story, describing where the author conveniently ignores certain aspects of a detective case in order to make the story work. Where the author, in other words, cheats. He lists a few of the cheats, some involving improbable characters, like a giant of international finance who doesn't really behave the way that a giant of international finance would. He mentions having God sit in your lap when a murderer requires perfect help from Providence to get an improbable series of events to work perfectly. The solution that knocks the keenest mind for a loop because only a halfwit could guess it. Right? These are just kind of some of the cheats that Milne uses. Modern versions of this story, according to Chandler, end up having more chic, but not more truth. But there's the same stock characters who do the same stock things. And so here again are kind of the stock elements in the plot of a detective story that he lays out. Number one, there's the utterly incomprehensible trick of how someone stabbed another in front of 15 stunned visitors. Right? That's the set piece. Like, whoa, how did that happen? Something happened. It's unexplainable. There's a mystery. And it hits you in the face. Number two, there's the same damsel screaming in the night, ensuring that people enter and exit during some precise moment, conveniently. Number three, there's the same moody silence as the guests stare at each other during the revelation. And four, there's the same flat-foot detectives crawling around. Right? You're just going to have those kinds of set pieces because those set pieces are the familiar anchors that grip the world of the story and let you know what kind of story you're involved in. It tells you the kind of rules to expect. Does that make sense? Okay. So we enjoy the permutations of those stories, given those kind of anchor points. We also enjoy the repetitions. Because things repeat and they follow the same basic recipe and the same basic formula, we're able to have our attention drawn to the subtle difference that makes this story a little bit different than the last one. Right? And that becomes more enjoyable because you're like, oh, here's where it worked out this time, not that time. I mean, I read probably 80 of Agatha Christie's novels when I was 14, and each time I was like, oh, here's how it happened this time. I mean, they're all kind of the same, but they were different enough to let me be pleased by those differences individually, even though I read them pretty much as a mass set. We consume repetitively also, though, because it demands less of us. Right? If you read a whole bunch of detective fiction, it's not as demanding on it because you're familiar with it, right? And you don't have to think through all of its occurrences in the same sort of way as if it were a rare treat. And it also, once we consume repetitively, informs us when a real standout of the genre appears on the horizon, right? You're able to appreciate, if you read in that way, like, oh, this one's a great one. It's not just a good one, it's a great one. It does something masterful, and that lets you draw your attention to how it's masterful or what the differences are that kind of put it up above the rest. But these are all older stories. I mean, this is an old essay that we're reading. And Chandler admits this. So on page 11, he says, quote, they do not really come off intellectually as problems, and they do not come off artistically as fiction. They're too contrived and too little aware of what goes on in the world. They try to be honest, but honesty is an art. The poor writer is dishonest without knowing it, and the fairly good one can be dishonest because he doesn't know what to be honest about. He thinks a complicated murder scheme, which baffled the lazy reader who won't be bothered itemizing the details, will also baffle the police, whose business is the details. Right? And that's that gap between reality and honesty and the truth of fiction that Chandler's trying to point out. The point, though, isn't to find reality. The point is to escape. Chandler believes that this sort of escape is perfectly appropriate. Page 12, he writes, quote, "All men must escape at times from the deadly rhythm of their private thoughts. It is part of the process of life among thinking beings. All reading for pleasure is escape." Right? And just like the little genre box, you check your own problems out, you go into the box, deal with somebody else's problems, put the book down, and then enter back into your own life. That's all it is. You check out, you escape, you come back into it. But, Chandler says, even in our need for escape, we're still constrained by the thought of reality. This emerges in his criticism of Dorothy Sayers. He says, quote, page 12 still, "If it started out to be about real people, they must very soon do unreal things in order to form the artificial pattern required by the plot." The use of force, causing people to act unnaturally in order to satisfy a narrative demand, is what Chandler and what many readers resist. Is that fair? I would like to argue that this kind of resistance isn't simply aesthetic, it's also moral. Like Oedipus and like Fichte, we dislike this sort of constraint on our behavior and the implications that such forces always surround us in spite of ourselves. We're simultaneously drawn to and repelled by those sorts of narrative logics. We desire the way that they order and organize existence, but we want this pattern to emerge in retrospect. We want it to describe and not prescribe the nature of our lives.
So the story should just happen because it was going to happen.
Yeah. And you shouldn't have those like, well, no person would actually behave in that way at that time, right? It's unreasonable to get that angry over nothing, or it's that unreasonable to feel guilty for this when nobody, or whatever it would be. It's that kind of force that's required because of a narrative hoop that isn't human. And that's what Chandler resents.
And that's what he labels contrived and formal.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So, having set those kinds of authors aside, Chandler then moves on to discuss Dashiell Hammett, who is someone who wrote, quote, out of real things. He wrote for an audience that had a sharp, aggressive attitude to life, who were not afraid of the seamy side of things. They lived there. This is all quoted. Violence did not dismay them. It was right down their street. Hammett gave murder back to the kind of people that committed for reasons with the means at hand, right? And so it's no longer, like the ridiculous, dead butler with the sharp mustache, who's laying up there that nobody knows who killed him, and he was killed by some like oriental flower thorn that wasn't actually murder at all, that's not real life. And what Chandler loves about Hammett is the way that it makes murder real, because people do kill each other. But they often do it for reasons, and those reasons require really thinking about what society means and what it looks like. And that's what part of why at least Chandler's attracted to him. Does that make sense? Hammett's language for Chandler is also important. It was, quote, written in the kind of lingo readers imagined that they spoke themselves. It was, in a sense, but it was also much more. All language begins with speech, and the speech of common men at that. But when it develops to the point of becoming a literary medium, it only looks like speech. This style, which does not belong to Hammett or to anybody, is the American language. It can say things he did not know how to say. In his hands, it had no overtones. It left no echo. What Chandler points out is the way that Hammett's choice to write in a prose style assembled from the kind of language he heard around him, that's what allowed him to transcend that speech quality. So he started with what he heard in everyday life. He grounded, he immersed himself in it, And because he knew those cadences and rhythms so well, he could transcend it in a poetic dimension that was lacking in just the normal everyday discourse. This is why it only, quote, looks like speech, unquote. It reveals and concretizes the truths rooted in the American language that Hammett was notable for accessing. This is part of why Chandler writes, quote, Hammett demonstrated that the detective story can be important writing and also made the detective story fun to write, not an exhausting concatenation of insignificant clues, end quote. This transition, the one that he marks with Hammett, and that he also participates in himself, is what opens the possibility of the existential detective story. It's a shift from the empirical world of Fichtean determinism that one can observe without affecting, and into a world where the human dimension matters. And Chandler's point is that this shift occurs in the world of language that paints the world of the characters as well as their interaction. Does that make sense?
Say more about the language.
Yeah, we construct, for humans, everything in our world is automatically and always predicated in language. We can't escape the words that we have to define it. And so, I mean, one thing that you can do that's always an interesting task is to read something in the original language and then read its translation into another language and see what one offers that the other doesn't. There's a lot of untranslatable expressions or turns of phrase that make something poetic in one language that totally fail to in another. Or the best translations are the ones who open a very different kind of insight in one language that wasn't present in the first. Right? Words do different work. And even when you translate one word, the echoes or resonances of a word in one language don't have the same echoes or resonances in another. So what Chandler is saying is that the American language has its own system of truths. I mean, it's not just British English. Like there's a whole bunch else that's imported into American. And what it means to speak as an American is something that Hammett was able to hear. And in being able to hear it and being able to know it, he could construct an American detective fictional world that looked like the one that we inhabit. It sounded familiar, but it had a lot more truth to it. It was a lot more intentional. It became beautiful in a stark kind of way that just normal everyday patterns of words didn't get to. And so it opened up what the American language meant for readers in a way that normal conversation couldn't. Does that make more sense? It's a lot of Heidegger in there that I just reported also. I mean, translating a lot of that into that. But I think that Heidegger's work on how language really alters how we see a world.
Yeah.
The more words you have, the more nuanced your world can be, the more rich it can be. The fewer words you have, the more impoverished your world is. I mean, that's the logic behind like 1984, right? If you get rid of the word bad and you just have double plus ungood, everybody's thinking happy all the time, right? And so if you just take that insight and even expand on that, that's a little of what Chandler's getting into. Does that make more sense? Mm-hmm. All right. Page 16. Style is not enough. Chandler warns that the, quote, realistic style is easy to abuse. From haste, from lack of awareness, from inability to bridge the chasm that lies between what a writer would like to be able to say and what he actually knows how to say. It is easy to fake. Brutality is not strength. Flipness is not wit. End quote. Hammett's writing is distinctive enough that, quote, there are still, at least then, a number of people around who say that Hammett did not write detective stories at all. Merely hard-boiled chronicles of mean streets with a perfunctory mystery element dropped in. End quote. Chandler points out that what makes Hammett's fiction brilliant is the fact that the presence or absence of a puzzle in the text is irrelevant. The focus on character, on what's human and not on what's controlled, allows a puzzle into the story without displacing its greatness. Right? So rather than the earliest detective fictions, which start with a puzzle whose pleasure is seeing somebody work out step by step by step until there's an explanation, right? I mean, that's what's great about Agatha Christie. How did this come to be? Oh, here's one part, here's one part, here's one part. Voila, there's the answer. For Hammett, what happens is instead you have a character, and the character does things. And the character lives in a mean world that's violent and gritty and brutal. And the puzzle of the story, if there is one, yeah, there might be one, but the joy of it isn't this kind of mechanical, deterministic working out of what happened. It's instead watching how a human being maneuvers that world, and that world itself has mysteries, as does the character. Does that make sense?
Yeah, responds existentially.
Yeah, yeah. And that's my argument anyway. I mean, that's definitely the angle I'm trying to impress into here. So I'm glad it's working. Page 17. The realist novel for Chandler is one that acknowledges the injustice of the world in an unflinching fashion. Quote, "It's not a fragrant world, but it's a world you live in." Quote. "What makes such a thing art is the quality of redemption." That's another quote again. "It may be pure tragedy if it is high tragedy, and it may be pity and irony, and it may be the raucous laughter of the strong man. But down these mean streets a man must go who is not himself mean, who is neither tarnished nor afraid." End quote. Chandler's insight here is important. We believe in the detective because such a person allows us a lens into meaner places than many readers travel, and does so with a kind of integrity largely absent even in polite streets. Chandler continues his description on page 18, quote, "The detective in this kind of story must be such a man. He is the hero. He is everything. He must be a complete man and a common man, and yet an unusual man. He must be a man of honor. He must be the best man in his world and a good enough man for any world." End quote. Such a hero is not perfect and is likely to meet with opposition from moralists. Chandler, quote, "doesn't care much about his private life," end quote. It's how he looks for justice in the social world that becomes important. And this offers, I think, some insight into Oedipus and why we have sympathy with the figure of Oedipus. It's important because he offers us a peek into the world of politics of gods and men that the Greek rulers needed to battle. Right? That's not our world. That was Oedipus's world to inhabit. But through Oedipus, we also get a sense of what that world looks like. Oedipus seems like a good man. He thinks of himself as complete and at least potentially as common, especially after he finds out that what he thought were his parents weren't his parents, right? He was like, well, maybe I was a low birth, but that should be okay. Jocasta's okay. I think I've been a good king. Like, it'll work out. He wasn't horrified by the thought of that, but not as horrified as he was by the truth of who he was, which more horrible. He's unusual, though, right? And the tarnish that Oedipus has on him wasn't his fault, even though he was tarnished nonetheless. That's why we can sympathize with him, right? Something about us lets us get Oedipus in a way that we wouldn't necessarily get this kind of puzzle detective. Does that make sense? Chandler concludes his description of the detective in this way. Here's another kind of longer quote. "He is a relatively poor man, or he would not be a detective. He is a common man, or he could not go among common people. He has a sense of character, or he would not know his job. He will take no man's money dishonestly, and no man's insolence without a due and dispassionate revenge. He is a lonely man, and his pride is that you will treat him as a proud man, or be very sorry that you ever saw him. He talks as the man of his age talks, that is, with rude wit, a lively sense of the grotesque, a disgust for sham, and a contempt for pettiness. This story in this man's adventure in search of a hidden truth. He has a range of awareness that startles you, but it belongs to him by right. If there were enough like him, the world would be a very safe place to live in without becoming too dull to be worth living in." That's the detective. This, I think, does a nice job of exposing the trait of the existential detective par excellence. It's a person who's comfortable with the full range of human existence. Someone who is, in Paul Ricoeur's sense, fallible without being fallen. It's somebody who's capable of learning truth and comfortable exploring for truth in places where most angels fear to tread. Such a person is moral enough to maintain a compass within unsavory worlds, but familiar enough with the rougher edges of existence to see what is sordid in polite society. And such a detective, one believes, also has the capacity to fearlessly find truths within the self as well as within the world. That's what makes an existential detective. Does that make sense? Okay with that so far? Okay. That concludes the essay. And for the rest of the class, I'd like to just look at the other short story for tonight, Spanish Blood, and just do a reading of that quick, given what we've learned ahead. We okay to do that? All right. So, in Spanish Blood, De La Guerra, who's the detective, fits all of these criteria. He knows when he has to spend $100, and he knows when he needs to take money from the pocket of a corpse. He has a good sense of character in a lot of worlds, the suburban world, the underworld, the political world. He knows when to kill, and he knows when to duck. And he has to do some of both. Chandler's prose allows us to see how De La Guerra sees the world and how he can see death's fingerprints in nature, at the cabin, for example, as well as in the offices and the flop houses that his journey sends him to. He knows where to get the information that he needs, and he does so in a way that is unafraid. He doesn't necessarily play by the book, but he also doesn't abuse his power. He's careful of life. He says, quote, "I never shot a deer in my life. Police work hasn't made me that tough." Right? He doesn't kill needlessly, but he's not afraid to kill. He's willing to shoot and be shot at, willing to touch the bodies of the dead in ways that don't betray fear. Okay? Because he has an inner sense of integrity, he doesn't mind staring down crooked game wardens or his own wardens or his own crooked boss. He owns his space without fear. But this internal virtue doesn't leave him fearless or reckless. He knows he isn't Superman or even Batman. He bleeds. He hurts. He stays calm and focused. The sense of death is keen. When Joey Chill is shot, it occurs slowly. Chandler savors the moment for the reader. And so here's just that moment. Quote, "Glass tinkled at the window. There was a sound like the loose slap of a glove. A small piece of the window glass dropped to the bare stained wood beyond the carpet, almost at Joe Chill's feet. The little man stood quite motionless for 2 or 3 seconds. Then the glass fell from his hand, bounced and rolled against the wall. Then his legs gave. He went down on his side slowly, rolled over slowly on his back. Blood began to move sluggishly down his cheek from a hole over his left eye. It moved faster. The hole got large and red. Joey Chill's eyes looked blankly at the ceiling, as if those things no longer concerned him at all." It's a pretty good death scene.
Yeah.
And Joey Chill's killed for a stupid reason. He already gave the information that his death was meant to keep secret. It's someone that De La Guerra knew, Joey Chill was, at least as an acquaintance, but he doesn't sentimentalize the moment of his death. He knows that the death is part of his world, and he knows it better than I know it, probably better than you know it. Right? He's familiar with that world and the rules that govern that world's existence. Does that make sense? Well, what makes this an existential detective story? Here's why I would argue it is. It's solved only because De La Guerra knows the corpse and his wife. He understands the passions that motivate the human heart, and this understanding of relationships and people allows him uniquely to unlock the scene of the crime. The puzzle of the story isn't really about who killed Marr, even though this is the question that opens the story and the explanation that closes it. He understands why Marr would delay shooting when he knows his life is coming to an end, and he understands that the final impulse may be to protect rather than indict. But that's based on his ability to know Marr as a character and having the kind of character that allows him to have that kind of insight into others. That's the only thing that does it. De La Guerra doesn't require proof for any of this. All he requires is an understanding of what it means to be a human in a hard relationship. And he's got that down. In the end, De La Guerra says, quote, "Got the badge back. It's not as clean as it was. Clean as most, I suppose. I'll try to keep it that way." He ends up choosing an ending that allows for the most justice. Quote, "It's swell politics. Gets the city out from under the master's egg mob. It puts Drew on top for a little while, but he's too weak to last, so that doesn't matter." End quote. Then he leaves. His head hurts. He can't open his eyes. Perhaps he's like Oedipus in that way, at least for a little bit. He's seen too much. So that's at least interpretation of Spanish blood. Does that work? Okay. Any other questions for right now before I get to the implications?
And that dovetails with Oedipus. He's seen too much.
Mhm.
In fact, he looks too closely.
Yeah.
Are you going to talk about the deer?
I could in a minute. I wasn't going to get too much more into that.
Okay,
You want to hold that for then?
sure.
All right. Here are the implications. Number one, most of us, at some level, desire the kind of stability and predictability offered by formulaic fiction. At the very least, as readers, we enjoy being able to anticipate what will happen within a limited universe, and we delight in moments that are particular to a story. Reading formula fiction allows us to taste of the deterministic world lived by Oedipus without feeling its implications in our own lives. As humans, we also tend to seek the familiar and the predictable in ways that allow us to savor its interruptions. Make sense? Number two, the character of the detective, the hero of these kinds of stories, offers a sort of existential paragon. They're not the kinds of virtuous heroes that were offered in legends, and they're not vicious anti-heroes, the way you kind of get in some of the TV shows today. Instead, the plots of these stories disclose a character attuned to the heart, the small voice of conscience in Ficta, or the moment of anger in Oedipus. This orientation is at odds with both a moralistic adherence to social codes, and it's at odds with rebellious attempts to overthrow them. Right, so the detective is neither trying to obey nor rebel. The detective holds his own way through the middle. Number three, in terms of style, the detective is painted with unflinching, simple, straightforward terms. It's a prose that emerges out from common discourse, but that does more with it than speakers are generally able to do. It's a prose that listens to the language of those around and transforms these words into something more like a poetry that's able to produce new insights and new truths. It doesn't just repeat the common language, it enhances it, and it makes it more meaningful and more durable, more true. Number four, in terms of plot, the detective is able to navigate all elements of society and nothing is forbidden. The detective has insight into life because of this and uses this insight to solve cases that are motivated by the heart instead of the mind. Right? This kind of puzzle case is only for like abnormally rational people who know how to create the right kind of puzzle and see that puzzle through. That's not how most murders are committed. And that's why you need somebody like De La Guerra to solve a certain kind of murder that's more realistic than this kind of murder, which already feels artificial. Does that make sense? Number five, in terms of justice, detectives are more interested in the right ending than the good one. They'll allow a lie to become truth so long as that truth serves both society and those whom the detective loves. So that's that. What would you like to know about the deer?
So I know he was set up. Was he set up to besmirch his name just to get him out of town? And does the deer kind of stand for something else because of its?
I mean, he's set up by his boss just wants him out, right? And that's why he throws out like, and I know that you set me up, and there's this whole string of corruption that traces through. I mean, the whole system.
Right.
He just wants to get De La Guerra out and figure out what's going on. In terms of the deer, I mean, for me, the most notable thing about the deer is the fact that De La Guerra says, "I would never kill him." Yeah. And to me, that's the most. It shows that De La Guerra is very respectful of human life. And there's a real deep integrity for when to kill and when not to. And it's not just humans. Like, don't kill humans, but kill everything else. Like, he's really sensitive about when it's appropriate and when it's not appropriate to take a life. And that, to me, I mean, just that moment with the deer does a lot to show what kind of character that he has, even though in most ways it's totally and completely irrelevant to what the story is, right? It's important mostly to show the caliber of person that he is. And that's an important thing for the reader to learn. Other questions?
So how much of him deciding to let things stand as they are, which aren't really the truth, do we think is, the fact that he was once in love with this woman, and how much of it is just the justice thing?
I mean, it seems like the way he thinks through it, because you don't get the sense that he lies to himself very often. I mean, he seems pretty self-honest and fairly self-aware. And so when he thinks through it and he looks at, well, it gets the mob out, it gives Drew a little bit more power. I mean, also is the fact that, sure, he loved her. Okay. But it leads to a sense of justice. Like, and he's also, I mean, Mar was his friend, right?
Yeah.
And he wants to honor Mar's last wish, which was to protect her.
Yeah, that's
And so, I mean, it's not just her. It's kind of all those factors lead into the right justice, which isn't the good, right? I mean, a more quote unquote moral detective would have thrown her in jail, right? But that wasn't what his interest was, because that wouldn't be that bigger sense of justice that the existential detective is able to become aware of, where a more moral or more perfect person wouldn't be able to handle that. It's messy. It's a messy justice. But it feels right, even though it's technically wrong. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
This distinction between an existential detective and a moral detective is interesting to me. I kind of thought they were one and the same.
I mean, I guess when I say, I was using moral in kind of a weird sense.
Yeah, it probably is the most moral decision, really. What he does. It's not legalistic, maybe.
Yeah, and that's the distinction I'm trying to get to, right? I mean, there's the detective who wants, I mean, the kind of justice that says, you did X, you deserve Y. And that kind of X to Y adheres to a certain kind of perfection, like perfect moral code that looks at that as being the whole of justice. The guilty get what they deserve. And so that's what I meant by that kind of more legalistic kind of morality. Whereas the existential detective, things are a little fuzzier, and they're okay with that.
So we're talking about him acting without necessarily a claim to knowledge.
Well, like he had faith, right? He didn't have proof that it was he didn't have proof about who the murderer was, but he knew.
Mm-hmm.
And the kind of knowledge that he had looks like faith, right? It wasn't certain. I mean, again, in terms of ficta, I mean, faith is the most appropriate term, definitely, because it was conviction without certainty. And he was willing to act on that and to know that. I mean, not know in the certain sense, but he had faith that that's what happened. He was willing to act on his faith as a way of dealing with the case. Proof, I mean, there's no way to find proof, right? I mean, proof would require going back in time and seeing the moment. He's not going to get proof, but he has faith that his intuition about what it means to be human is dead on.
And I think that's part of why he says something about, we'll never know for sure what happened to the guy that apparently fell off the porch. I mean, that just kind of adds to the whole fuzziness of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is this helpful?
And you kind of used that example of finding the bullets of a faithful thing, of like, you don't go into that room except you are looking for that, and that's how things can be found.
Just a little bit of confirmation. And again, it doesn't prove anything. It wouldn't stand up in a court of law, but it confirms his faith for him in a way that isn't legal proof. It's not binding proof, but it helps for him to make that story that he's told himself as an interpretation of events far more likely. Right? It works as evidence for him, not for knowledge, but to have his faith become more substantiated, if that distinction makes sense.
So I was wondering if this was because I was trying to find the Oedipus connection through all of it. Because we talked a lot about in Oedipus, people know everything, but it can't change anything. His knowledge seems, because it affects what he does, it seems to impact the world. Maybe that's the fictive thing.
I mean, it doesn't too, right? I mean, because he could change the world in one way if he wanted to.
Right.
He doesn't though. He can't bring Mar back. He can't bring Joey Chill back. I mean, the people who are dead are dead. The most he can do is take a broken and shattered world and make it a little less messy. according to his, I mean, this is his stance on it, right? I mean, he's not asking anybody else's opinion about what Messi would look like or what it wouldn't look like. You know, he's just willing to say, here's what I think a better world would be. But it doesn't. I mean, his knowing that just makes him sad. I mean, when you look at him at the end, his figuring out what the murder was breaks his heart. I mean, it doesn't lead to it doesn't change anything except makes him suffer more.
And he also says it doesn't change the politics. The political machinations are going to just
They're gonna go.
they're gonna
I mean,
unfold.
this
the way-
mob is out of the way for now.
Mhm.
You know, this inspector's up on top for now, but he's too weak and they're too strong. I mean, there's a shift, but it's not a permanent one. The good guys aren't going to come out on top. I mean, at least not in a permanent sense. Maybe for a little bit.